Hi, you guys. This is Richard Sachs. Welcome back. This is Lost Arts Radio, and we have a great friend and guest today that I was hoping could join us again. I had read an article by Betty Freyhoff in News with Views, which is a good site to subscribe to if you want to get interesting articles every day from all kinds of very good writers, including Alex, I think, sometimes. But Betty was talking about Alex Newman's work. And Alex has been on the show multiple times before, and it always goes by in minutes. We have great discussions, and I hope you'll enjoy this one. Alex is actually an educator. He's also a writer and foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine. And really great articles, and he's involved in a private school that you'll want to know about. But this particular tour, if Betty was accurate, and I think she probably is, it has a lot to do with rescuing our children. Even if you don't have kids, you're affected by all the kids that are growing up to become the future leaders of the country and the world. And they're under assault right now, not only from the so-called educational system, but a lot of things that are working in harmony with it to really make the future as bad as possible before the steps after that happen. So Alex is aware of all that stuff, as many of you are, and that's what we're going to talk about, as well as potential ideas for solutions. So welcome, Alex, and thanks for giving us the time in the middle of your tour. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Richard. It's always a pleasure, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, so thank you.
Yeah, it's great. I want everybody to know about your work, and at least most people, I think, who are not hypnotized by mainstream media right now are hearing things like, there's some weird stuff being taught in public schools everywhere from preschool all the way up through PhD and medical levels in the university. And I'm in the middle of the higher education stuff still, so I can vouch for that. I think at the lower levels, one of the things that's interesting is it's actually getting younger and younger, because if they can keep most of the population financially stressed, then you don't have any parents at home to take care of really young children. Kind of an unnatural situation, talking about, how biology works. And so the kids have to go somewhere to be taken care of, and the government just happens to step in as the babysitter. And what they're doing with that time is an interesting subject in itself. So to put this whole thing together in a coherent picture in a short time that we've got here, so that you can run off to your next tour preparation, where do we start in giving people an overview of what's happening so that we'll lay the groundwork for potential countermeasures and solutions?
Well, I think you just gave a very good summary, Richard. Thank you for that. And, they are trying to get children at the youngest possible ages into government care. That's why you see now this scramble to have federally funded, preschool programs and pre-K programs. Yeah. And they want the kids at the youngest possible ages. I mean, California right now, they just passed legislation creating they're calling it the cradle to career data gathering.
That's kind of an interesting subliminal equation between career and grave, isn't it?
Right, exactly. Right. But in some countries they were actually honest about this. I spent most of the last decade in Sweden, and there the government just came out and openly said we're going to structure the tax code so that both parents have to work. We don't want any women staying home with their children. We're going to set up a government-funded program so that as soon as your child is old enough to be without you, it's only like 95% of Swedish babies after age 1 are in government care for the overwhelming majority of the day, so that mom and dad can both go to work. So it starts very young, and the younger they can get them, the better from their perspective. And they've been telling us now for a while they want parents out of the picture, right? On MSLSD, you had Melissa Harris Perry show up and say that we need to collectively rear our children, right? We need to invest more in the collective
rearing. The village, right?
That's right. That's what Hillary Clinton said. We need a village to raise the children. She's talking about a government village, obviously. And this is now official policy in the United States. They put out a policy document in the last year of the Obama administration saying parents could be equal partners with the government in the raising of their own children.
If they're good, yeah.
Go ahead, Rich.
If they behave themselves.
Right, exactly. And that's what they say. We need mandatory home visits to go check that the parents are behaving
I wasn't kidding.
Yeah, no, and that's pretty soon. Parents will be the junior partners, and after that, well, hey, what do we need parents
After that,
for?
there will be a picture of them on the wall.
That's right. But yeah, the Secretary of Education at the time, he was saying we need government boarding schools. He said we
that was
kids 24/7.
The federal Secretary of Education.
Yes,
right?
that was the U.S. Department of Education, the head of it.
One of the challenges here is, we can easily speak to the people who are somewhat familiar with this, that read all those News with Views articles and listen to Alex, whose last name I can't mention anymore, will be banned before the show airs. But the other people who don't, and watch MSNBC and watch CNN and all the official approved stations, so that you'll not have those conspiracy theorists and stay on the right track with knowing what's going on. We want to reach some of them too, as many as possible. And you were talking about your book before, which we'll get into later, and the fact that a lot of the public is no longer reading because it's so much faster and easier to just watch videos and listen to what you're supposed to think. But if you're coming from the conventional mindset, what the picture and the whole package that you're presenting is kind of beyond a sci-fi movie, if people really let themselves grasp it. So if you are introducing that sci-fi world, which we actually are in, to people who are trained well by CNN, how would you introduce them to what's going on?
Well, that's a great question, Richard. And one of the things that I do in my presentation, I've got a projector with me and a PowerPoint presentation, because this stuff is so out there that even people who have a sense of what's going on would find some of it hard to believe. And so what I do is I've got my whole presentation loaded with videos. So I show videos of George Bush and Nancy Pelosi and Bill Clinton and Joe Biden and MSLSD and Secretary of Education and the head of the United Nations and the head of the UN's Education Agency. I show videos of all these people telling you what they're doing to your children, right? And what they're doing more broadly, and more particularly what they're doing to your children in the public school system. So, I show videos as one example of an assistant superintendent in California, an assistant superintendent of the public school system, explaining why they need to teach pedophilia to the children, right? As part of this mandatory LGBT history training. This is
are most of those
stuff.
Quotes in your mind that you have memorized at this point?
A lot of them, yes.
If so, why don't we put them in a little bit chronological order for less shock value, and start out with Bush or before, and what kind of things, and also that shows it's not that you're saying all the Republicans are wonderful and the Democrats are terrible. It's not like that. They work together in harmony and playing the good cop, bad cop sometimes. And if you went back to at least Bush, how did they start out saying things that you're not supposed to be shocked by because of the music or whatever, and it's supposed to be normal?
Right. Well, and that's one of the things I do. Actually, I show a clip of George H.W. Bush talking about the New World Order and how it'll be a world order in which a credible United Nations will use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the vision of the UN's founders. Joe Stalin and his minions on one side, and then Joe Stalin and his minions on the other. Right. We sent a guy called Alger Hiss to represent us, and he took everybody down to Bohemian Grove so they could stand in front of their 40-foot stone owl. They made him the first Secretary General of the UN, and then we threw him in prison because he was working for Joseph Stalin. So I show that, and then I show Bill Clinton talking about the New World Order. I show Joe Biden talking about the New World Order. And, George H.W. Bush says something really important in that clip that I show. He says, when we are successful, and we will be, right? No doubt at all that they're going to be successful. He doesn't say, if we work really, really hard, we'll convince enough people and everybody will join willingly. And we will be, right? And the reason why is they got 87% of our kids being brainwashed.
They have some reason to be confident.
Absolutely. I mean, if you controlled the minds of 87% of America's children, you'd be pretty confident, too, that you'd succeed, right? I mean, Adolf Hitler pointed out that whoever owns the youth gains the future. And, that's the reality of it. It's more powerful than any army, any navy, anything else.
So since we're having to do this at chipmunk speed, because our time's going to be up before we know it, in 30 seconds or less, for people that have no idea except that it's a conspiracy theory, what's this New World Order thing?
Well, George H.W. Bush gave us a really good clue. A world in which a credible UN will use its peacekeeping role. He's talking about their military forces, right? The goobers with the blue helmets and the tanks and the machine guns that run around the world raping women and children. 60,000.
They're doing it for peace, and that's what's okay. Yeah,
Right.
And the tanks and everything, too.
Yeah, right. I mean, talk about doublespeak, right? And if you look at the history of the UN's peace troops, they're absolute barbarians. I mean, they're basically used to eradicate any and all opposition to communism, globalism, totalitarianism, and that's historically what they've been doing, and raping children on the side on an industrial scale. Absolutely grotesque.
I don't think the MSNBC watchers heard about that part.
No, and they wouldn't, right? But actually, I've been working with a network of former UN officials, including people who were involved in investigations, right, in different UN agencies, senior people. They estimated that 60,000 women and children were raped by UN forces in just the last 10 years, right, just during the term of Ban Ki-moon. That is an enormous amount of people, and 0 of them are sitting in jail. So that gives you a sense of what this new world order enforced by the UN's peace troops is going to look like. And you had George Soros, money bags for the far left, talking about we're going to have communist China own the new world order. He says they have a better functioning government than the United States. I mean, yeah, I guess you would think that if you were a totalitarian and you wanted to enforce population control and force people off their land and force people to do what you say, then their government is way more efficient than ours, no question.
Yeah, it's a good model.
Yeah, but that's the model of the New World Order. If people need to understand that Communist China is going to play a starring role. And, if you want to understand what kind of the guiding ideology of this, they call it sustainable development. And it sounds like such a nice term. How could you be against sustainable development?
Yeah, either you're in favor of that or you want things that aren't even sustainable and you're crazy.
Right, then you want to destroy the planet, and you hate Gaia, and
exactly.
What kind of climate criminal are you, right? So that is what humanity is facing right now. And so one of the things I do is to show people a little bit about what they mean by sustainable development. They've been pretty transparent about it. They produce an Agenda 21 book for children. They tell you the Earth groans every time a new baby is created. Yeah, that's their ideology. They want to get rid of private property rights. They've said so. They want to get rid of private ownership in land. They want to reduce the population, and they tell us that they're working towards that. In fact, the UN's population agency got caught working with the communist Chinese on forced abortions. Right, nice people, these guys. Right, they want to stack everybody together in cities, get rid of independent farmers and ranchers. Right. They have totalitarian ambitions. They want to redistribute our
private property is also not sustainable, right?
No, that's what they tell you. The UN has literally put out reports. That's right. No more cars. They've literally put out reports saying that we need to get rid of private ownership, especially in land, because it's an instrument of social injustice. It's a way that people accumulate wealth. And when you have all the dictators of the world praising this ideology, when you have Kim Jong-un and Robert Mugabe and the Castros saying that this is going to be awesome, that's going to usher in a brave new world, you know that you have a problem, right? And that's what we've been seeing.
Right. Okay, so when you're talking about, I forget your exact statement. A few minutes ago, you said the person in charge of education for the federal government, Secretary of Education, I think you said, was talking about how the government needs to be show and affirm that it's the real parent, and that the biological parents just happen to be momentarily useful, and after that they just get in the way, kind of thing. Actually, federal government's really not supposed to be involved in education at all, correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, from a constitutional standpoint, that's very clear. There's, the Constitution delegates certain powers to the federal government, and you can read it all day, every day, backwards, forwards, sideways. You'll never find any authority whatsoever for involvement in education. And that means, the founders were actually explicit. They put it in there, the 10th Amendment, saying that if a power is not delegated to the United States, then it's reserved for the states or for the people. So really, the federal role in education should be zero, nada, zilch.
Right. Yeah, there's something called the enumerated powers list, right? Where is that? Do you remember?
Article 1, Section 8. Yep.
Yeah, and there's that list, and it's got very specific things that the government's allowed to do, the federal government, and it says in the 10th Amendment, nothing else.
That's right. Yep. And it was clear to the founders that nothing else was implied in the document. Why would you list all the powers if you were then going to go on to say, well, actually, you can do anything you want? I mean,
yeah, and anything we forgot, you can do that too, right?
Right, exactly. Right? Can you imagine how ludicrous that would be? Right. So there was always an understanding among the people who created this and the people for generations that followed that if it wasn't authorized, it was by definition, it was unauthorized. And so, just to be extra sure, they put in that 10th Amendment just to make sure nobody could ever possibly misinterpret it if we all got dumbed down by a government education system that they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. No. But and now it's even worse than just the feds. One of the things I spend a lot of time on in my presentation is the United Nations role in education. It's out in the open too. I show a clip of the Secretary General of the UN saying education needs to create global citizens who are ready to shape the future. The head of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization blabbering about the need to transform the values and attitudes of children so that they can shape the future as responsible global citizens. I mean, that's what they're doing.
A lot of the problem of this is that the language is so subtle because it sounds at the surface, if you're not really paying attention, it sounds wonderful because, wow, global citizens, harmony all over the world, everybody nice to each other, universal prosperity. Yeah, we have to be global citizens. It's just obviously the right thing to do because the alternative is everybody killing each other, and that doesn't seem very good.
That's right.
So what's the hidden trap of global citizens? It sounds so wonderful.
Yeah, well, the whole idea of global citizenship, the whole idea of global government has now come out of the closet. They're telling us on national television that that's what they're doing. But there's some real problematic aspects to this, even just from a secular point of view. You just look at this and say, wow, what could go wrong? Well, a lot could go wrong, right? We know that historically, concentrated power tends to attract the exact wrong kind of people, right? So when you have a big, powerful government, it's like a magnet for psychopaths and megalomaniacs to try to take it over. Look back at human history. Look around the world today, and you see that these types of people tend to dominate whenever you find a coercive apparatus where power and money are concentrated. And then, the idea of separate nations really serves as a very powerful check on the ability of governments to behave irresponsibly. So this was the idea between our federalist system where we have state governments that have their own sphere of authority. The thinking was this would prevent governments from doing anything too stupid, right? Like what if the state of California decided to increase the income tax to 90%? Well, they would very quickly find themselves with no taxpayers, right? Because everybody would leave. They'd move to Nevada and Arizona and just what you guys need. And they'd move to Idaho and Montana, right? People would say, oh my goodness, no, please stay there. Build the wall, right? But this serves as a really powerful check on governments. And when you have a global government, well, what are you going to do? Move to Mars if they get too abusive? Are you going to move to the moon? Obviously not, right?
Yeah, that is a problem. And so, but the issue too that I guess they didn't solve is that state governments can go crazy too. And the federal Constitution doesn't really prevent that, does it?
Well, there are some restrictions on what state governments can do. One of the most important being that they're required to have a Republican form of government.
Yeah.
So, if they decide we're going to actually make a dictatorship here in our state, well, that's not going to work. We're going to make a monarchy. We're going to make a democracy, whatever. Nope. Constitution requires a Republican form of government. And there are some limitations on what the states can do. In fact, the Supreme Court has incorporated the Bill of Rights to apply to the states, although that was never necessarily intended. The idea that Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, etc. That was intended to apply to Congress, even though the Supreme Court has distorted that and said, well, that means you can't say a prayer in your city council meeting, for example. So that was really an abuse and a misinterpretation of the First Amendment. But we also have state constitutions, and really state government is much more accountable to people, and so it typically becomes more difficult for very small political groupings to become so crazy. So if you look, for example, at the little principalities of Europe, the little kingdoms of Europe, what you find is typically those have maintained more freedom. Liechtenstein is really an incredible example, 32,000 citizens, and yet one of probably the freest society on the planet. in so many ways, right? I mean, taxes are 1%. It's a very, very free society. Switzerland also a very free society because political power is so decentralized, right? People make decisions at the local level, maybe the cantonal level. And so this decentralization has always provided a very powerful check on the ability of governments to misbehave. But if you were to go to a global government, that would be lost, right? There would be nowhere to run to and nowhere to hide. And so that's, these are just the superficial arguments against globalism. Then when you realize that it's a bunch of psychopaths pushing this, you realize, whoa, that's a really bad idea.
So there's a couple of things that the founders didn't figure out answers to or really foresee thoroughly. And that one of them was that the kind of people that you just described would end up filling all the major power positions, not only in government, but in corporations.
Yep. And, I think they tried to address that. They built in these checks and balances and the thinking, because I think the founders had a good understanding of human nature. They understood that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They understood that we live in a fallen world and that people can be greedy and selfish and bad. And so they tried to design a system where people's greed and ambition and selfishness would actually be restrained by these other branches of government. So if Congress went too crazy, the president could veto things. If the president went too crazy, the Congress could remove him or pass laws restraining him or override his vetoes. And so they built all these checks and balances into the system with the full understanding that, man is not perfect. In fact, they said, if men were angels, we wouldn't even need this government to govern them. But men are not angels. And so we need to put in these restraints. Yeah. And unfortunately, the biggest problem with the Constitution is just that it hasn't been obeyed for several generations now. They've acted like it's not even there. And exactly. So all these restraints that were built in are slowly being eroded and knocked over to the point where now we have a monster that really behaves as if there were no restraints on its ability to act, and that's very dangerous.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned before, it's a constitutional republic, not a democracy, for the reason that in a democracy you can vote for the worst things, and if you're in the majority, you can kill the minority or enslave them or whatever you want. And that's what they were trying to avoid, I think, with the Constitution being at the center of it. But that is a little bit like a monarchy in a way, because in a monarchy, if you have a wonderful, wise, benevolent king, it's great. If his kids get in and they kill everybody, it's not great. And it's the same with a constitution. If it's written by really wise people, it can be like that benevolent monarch, preventing the crazy people from voting something terrible. If you had a bad constitution, it would be hell. So, fortunately, the Constitution was written with a lot of wisdom. That's why it has value, I think, not just because it's a constitution, because that could be anything.
Yeah, well, the founders really had some incredible insight into these questions. James Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 10 about the difference between republics and democracies, and the way I think you hit the nail on the head. If you live in a democracy, the majority can vote for any kind of crazy idea they want, and we know people have this sinful nature. They want to steal other people's stuff. They want to control other people. And so, I think there's a great analogy. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Well, obviously the sheep is going to be for dinner, right? So we need to really restrain that. And what the founders said, I think it's just brilliant. What they wrote in the Declaration of Independence: we are all created equally, and we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. They said this was a self-evident truth. It's not even up for debate. It's obvious. You just have to look around. And that we actually formed governments to protect these rights. So they established that the reason why we had a government, the reason why we had rule of law, was to protect our rights. And so if the majority woke up one day and said, I think actually we should censor the newspaper and disarm everybody and then kill everybody we don't like. Well, right. No, we established a government to protect our rights. You can't do that, right? I mean, that's
then you have to decide what your rights are. Like, some people might say, oh, yeah, well, we totally agree, and you have a right to a universal basic income, right, and $100 an hour minimum wage, so everybody will be rich.
We should just say $1 trillion minimum wage, right?
Exactly. That would be incredible. It would be like beyond heaven on earth.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And if you don't agree, then you're a monster. And we should call Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and ask her, what's wrong with $1 trillion? Do you hate us? You don't want us to be rich?
Exactly. If you don't agree with that, you're a racist. But with that AOC was in favor of as high of a minimum wage as possible, right? Or at least so that everybody would be rich and be done with that irritating problem. And the fact that, I guess what I was getting at is it's the interpretation of the words used by the founders in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Federalist Papers, and elsewhere that makes the issue. Because if you have a right to a high minimum wage so that you're rich, and you have a right to universal basic income if you don't want to work, and you have a right to things like that, and the government's job is to protect your rights, there's an issue. And it leads into the question, what happened to California? The government there and the people that are supporting it. What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And really what happened is the education system has now brainwashed several generations of our people into not understanding what rights really are. When our founders talked about inalienable rights, they talked about this as a self-evident truth, right? It can't possibly be a self-evident truth that you have a right to a universal basic income, right? If you're born into, our founders really looked to biblical principles and to natural law to come up with these ideas, right? They didn't invent these ideas. They just enshrined them into the founding documents of our nation. And, the concept of natural law, for example, just leave the Bible out for just a moment. The concept of natural law, suppose you're born into a forest. Well, if you're born into a forest and there's nobody around, you have a right to collect berries and eat those berries. So you have a right to private property. You have a right to, build yourself a cabin, and that cabin then becomes your property. You have a right to say what you want to say. You have a right to worship your creator in the way that your conscience dictates you want to worship your creator. And so they viewed these things, this idea of negative rights, right? The government cannot coerce you into surrendering your right to free speech. The government cannot coerce you into, giving up your private property without fair compensation. And so that's the perspective they were coming from. And yet, as a result of the indoctrination in the government school system, now you have a generation of people who don't understand these things. They say, well, I like food, so I should have a right to food. Well, somebody's got to grow that food. What are they going to be your slaves? You're going to whip them if they don't grow your food quickly enough for the right kind of food for you? You got to think about these things. You can't have a right to take other people's stuff. You have a right to keep your own stuff. And that's where our founders were coming from. And unfortunately, that really has been lost in our country.
Right, because everybody assumes now if you get something, it's because the government gave it to you.
Right.
So how could you not have a right to everything given to you?
That's right. It's unfair. I have a right to
is unfair.
Free health care and a mansion and a nice car and all that kind of stuff. It's a very dangerous ideology because it becomes a tool for totalitarians to manipulate people and to divide people against each other and to accumulate more power. So if you have all these rights to all these things, that means the government must have the authority to go take these things from other people so that they can give them to you. I mean, that's what follows logically from that. And that opens the door to a very dangerous situation.
In fact, de Blasio, from New York on the stage with the Democratic candidates in the debate said, yeah, of course we want people who have things to have a 70% tax rate. And I guess the understanding is, agreeing with what you said, how are we going to take all this stuff to give you unless somebody pays all their income in taxes?
Yeah. And that's where this is going. They want to take more and more of people's property, more and more of people's income, and use it for their pet projects. And, obviously they siphon off a big part of it for themselves. They want more and more people to become dependent, not just on the government school system, but they want, the government to people to become dependent on the government feeding them, people to become dependent on the government housing them and clothing them, because dependent people are much easier to control. It's like livestock. Right. Well, yeah, your livestock gets free health care. Yeah, I take good care of my cows. I make sure they get to the vet when they have an illness. But hey, they're livestock, right? And we eat them when we're done.
Yeah.
So I tell people, if you want free health care, if you want somebody to take care of your every need, we have a place like that. It's like a utopia, right? Free food, free dental care, free health care. We call it prison because you don't have any freedom there, right?
Why do you think it's so hard for people to understand what you're trying to say in that example?
Because they've been so brainwashed in the government school system. I think that's really, this was very widely understood for centuries in America, right? Our forefathers who came here came with these ideas deeply ingrained, and this, I mean, they didn't invent this stuff. We had a long tradition going back to, the Magna Carta and even before. A lot of this comes straight out of the Bible. God has given us freedom of conscience. God said, "Thou shalt not steal," so you have a right to private property. I mean, this stuff has been part of our civilization for millennia now. What's different now from back then is Caesar didn't used to educate children, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Caesar's power over the minds of people was severely limited because he didn't have access to children for 12 straight years, for 7 days a week, for 5 days, 5 days a week, for 7 hours a day. He didn't have that, and so he couldn't shape people's thinking in that way. Now Caesar has all that and then some, right? Then you send them for 4 years for college brainwashing, and now we get them in pre-K so we can, start the brainwashing when they're 3 years old. Pretty soon you end up with a society where people can't think, people don't understand freedom, people can't even, read anything, which is where we are today. Half of Americans can't read according to the government's data. This is catastrophic. This is so dangerous.
Do you think California is kind of leading the way where this is going as far as education for the country?
I do. That old saying that as California goes, so goes the nation. It's a cliche because it's real. It's true. California isn't actually the pioneer. I tell people Sweden is where a lot of this stuff has been tried out first, and also some of the communist countries. But they bring it into California first, California and increasingly Illinois and New York too, and then from there it spreads out across the country. So California is really at the forefront of this. And if you want to know where your state's going to be in 10 years, maybe 5 years, look at where California is today, and it'll give you a good idea.
And you've had a lot of inside view of Sweden and been there quite a bit yourself, right? Yeah.
I spent most of the last decade there, and it's kind of like a petri dish for the New World Order globalists. They try out their ideas. That's where so much of this came from. The LGBT, the homosexual marriage, the transgender stuff, the welfare state. So much of this was implemented over there first, and then brought over to the United States, primarily through California first, right?
So, and what's going on now? What's the latest in Sweden that we can look forward to?
Well, they've banned home education. They're kidnapping homeschool children.
Wow. You got to talk a little. This is like a big deal. They made homeschooling illegal.
They did, yep. They took a page from Adolf Hitler and criminalized home education. Started sending in stormtroopers to go kidnap homeschool kids, including some who were even trying to flee the country. They sent in stormtroopers to a Turkish Airlines flight with a family that was trying to leave Sweden to homeschool in India. And
wow, and they got them off the airplane so they couldn't escape the country?
They did, yeah. And it's been years now since the poor boy has seen his parents.
Wow.
Horror story of immense proportions. And they also closed off all other exits, right? So, the so-called private schools, they got them all hooked on government money, and now they forced them all to teach the government's curriculum, which, by first grade, the kids need to be explaining that gender is a social construct and, all this kind of quackery. So very dangerous. And if you want to see a sneak preview of the future, you can look to Sweden, not just on education also, but, the environmental stuff, the sustainability stuff, the mass immigration, right? You have a situation now where Sweden will probably be a minority in their own country within 15 years. They already are in some of their major cities. Yeah. That's coming. That's coming. So
and the freedom of speech issue is pretty central to the whole thing too, right?
Oh, they have no freedom of speech now. I mean, they have freedom to say what the government wants them to say, but as soon as you step outside of that, very serious consequences, up to and including prison. I mean, you can now spend more time in prison in Sweden for what they describe as hate speech, which is really any speech that the regime hates. You can spend more time in prison for that than for rape of a child. That's a true story.
Wow.
So gives you a sense of how backwards the priorities there are.
So, like, just for people that may not know, I mean, I'm sure they figure they tuned into some sci-fi movie with the show, but okay, why? Everybody knows hate speech laws are wonderful because nobody should hate anything, and hate is really uncomfortable, and if you outlaw it, then everybody's happy. So, what's wrong with hate speech laws?
Right. Well. What we're seeing, and you're right. They start off saying, well, we don't want people to hate Jews. We don't want people to hate Muslims. We don't want people to hate homosexuals. And so we need laws to control that kind of speech. Right, exactly. Yeah. And what you see now, again, you can look to Sweden or even the United Kingdom now, this is happening. They're throwing pastors in prison for speaking out against homosexuality and the indoctrination of children, for literally quoting the Bible. I mean, they go up to street preachers now in the UK and they entrap them and say, "What do you think about homosexuality?" And say, "Well, here in God's word it says." Boom, you're busted, right? Off to jail.
Wait, how is that trap set up? Who's trapping who, and what's going on with that?
Oh, yeah. In the UK, the homosexual activists will go up to street preachers and ask them about homosexuality and, get this all on tape. And as soon as they say, well, the Bible says XYZ about homosexuality, boom, you just violated our hate speech laws.
Wow. And most people don't know the latest hate speech laws that are affecting them, I suspect.
That's right. They change constantly, right? It's now at the point where you can be put in prison in some European countries for criticizing mass immigration, for criticizing the religion of Islam, right? For criticizing Muhammad, for criticizing homosexuality. And, once you start restricting what people are allowed to say, you really have a big problem. First of all, because it's a fundamental violation of your most basic human rights, right? I mean, one of your most basic rights of all is to
don't
speak.
Depend on what country you live in, right? They're not rights from the U.S. government or something.
That's right. I mean, as our founders put it, these are God-given rights. These are inalienable rights. They're inherent to you as a person. No government has legitimate authority to restrict your ability to criticize bad ideas or to even criticize good ideas, right? Yeah. I mean, that's part of living in a society. You have to hear sometimes things that you don't agree with that you might find objectionable, but that's just part of being a human being. We can't throw people in jail for saying things we don't agree with, and yet that is what is happening right this moment. And in America, we're lucky because we have the First Amendment, but they're doing everything they can to break that down now too.
Right. We don't really have it because, we've had things banned off our channel because of using it.
Yep.
And you can't do that because I guess, it's not just racist stuff. Things about real information on health and things like that are now becoming illegal to talk about here too.
That's right.
So,
and if you go through the New American Magazine, you'll find a lot more details on all these things we've talked about. You can see we wrote extensively on the ban on homeschooling. We've written extensively on the throwing of pastors into prison, the erosion of free speech. So all kinds, if people want to get more in depth, I know we're really limited on time. We've got tons of information on that for people who want the details.
Okay, so how do they get a hold of the New American Magazine?
You can start by going to the online portal, thenewamerican.com, and we've got a search function there. So, say you're interested in the homeschool ban in Sweden, just type in Sweden homeschooling. You'll find, all the articles we've done on that. And then if people want to subscribe to the print magazine, there is a subscribe button right there. You'll get 2 issues every week delivered to your door. And also we have the online edition. We send that out every day, the 5 or 6 most important headlines of the day, and that's for free. So anybody who wants, reliable, good information coming to their inbox every day can just subscribe to that, put your email address in, and we won't spam you, we won't sell it to anybody, but we will give you the news you need to stay up to speed on what's happening. So.
And is that a good enough source if you really want to know what's going on in Sweden, or do you need something additional for that?
I think the New American has done a lot of the best reporting, but there's all kinds of, if people are curious about Sweden, I could recommend all sorts of things. Probably the most edifying book I ever read on Sweden was called The New Totalitarians. Incredibly good book. It was actually written back in the 70s by a South African newspaper man who was on assignment there for a British publication, living in Stockholm as their Scandinavian bureau chief. And it really so much insight into the role that Sweden kind of played in being a testing ground for these kooky ideas, and why Sweden was really the ideal society for this because of the existing culture and the existing mentality there. It's fascinating stuff. But we'll have a lot on that in the New American. And then if people want more, a good search engine, anything but Google is a good place to start.
Yeah, exactly. Look stuff up on DuckDuckGo. That's about the best big one I've found so far.
Yeah,
and everybody should get the New American Magazine for sure. One of the, a lot of the people that don't understand, say Scandinavian countries and especially Sweden, are really great because so many things are free.
Free until you pay your taxes. 77% of your money goes to the government, and then you get a little bit left over to go drink a beer and pay for your microchip. But
yeah, well, the other thing that's great, even if besides that, is that there's no gun violence because nobody has firearms, right?
Right, exactly. Actually, now they're using grenades. They're literally throwing grenades into a park. They blew up a little kid the other day with a grenade.
But you're not allowed to have your own grenades. You're talking about the bad people who are breaking the law, right?
Right, yeah. All we need is to just ban grenades, and then suddenly we'll have no more grenades, right? Wouldn't that be nice?
I don't understand why they couldn't figure it out. You just ban criminals, and everything should be fine.
Why didn't anybody think of that, Richard? It's just crazy. I mean, all ththese geniuses in Parliament, you'd think somebody would have thought of that. But no, it's absolutely grotesque what's happening there. And and for the people who say, well, Sweden, socialism works in Sweden. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. I have a friend in Sweden. His name is Nima Sanandaji. He's an Iranian. I brought there as a child. And he did what I think is probably the most interesting study on the whole socialism question with regards to Sweden. It's called Scandinavian Unexceptionalism. The book was so good, I reviewed it for the New American because it just blew my mind. Wow. And what he shows is that the reason Sweden became wealthy and prosperous was because they had such a free market economy until the 1950s. They were one of the freest economies in the world during the time when they really started building up wealth, building up capital, building up production and factories. And then it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s when the government really started playing this huge role in the economy. And one of the most interesting aspects of the book, Richard, is his study of Scandinavians in America. And this blows people's mind because they're, well, look, the Swedes live so much longer than we do. It must be because they have government health care. Well, actually, right. It's interesting because if you look at the Scandinavians who live in America, they live longer than their Scandinavian relatives back in Scandinavia, and they're richer, and they're more equal, and they have better health. So in every metric that you can measure, Scandinavians in America actually do better than Scandinavians in Scandinavia, and yet they'll never tell you this, right? Why is it that Scandinavians
what happened? Why did it change from prosperous and more free over to socialist in the 50s and 60s? What happened with that?
Well, the Social Democratic Party, which really had some very nasty roots, they subscribed to this eugenics quackery, that their racial doctrines, a lot of this stuff. So they really had nasty roots, but they came into power over 100 years ago, and for a long time they kind of behaved themselves. They realized that Sweden is a small country. We've got to compete with the world, and we've got to be economically free. But gradually, with the Soviet influence, the Soviet Union wasn't too far away. The penetration of these political parties, they started moving more and more towards a welfare state, government taking over larger and larger sectors of the economy. And by the 1980s, it was becoming absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, the government was running fast food restaurants. They were on the verge of passing this law that companies had to every year hand over more and more ownership of themselves to their employees. So they were going to, try to transfer ownership of all the economy from the owners of these companies to the workers through this mandatory scheme with the government managing it all. But eventually, it all came crashing down. Sweden went through an enormous economic crisis in the 90s. And that forced them to reverse course, and they actually started going back in the direction of economic freedom. They're still very totalitarian on other things, but in a sense, they were more pragmatic. They realized that, wow, if we want to keep this monstrous system afloat, we're going to at least have to have some wealth production to support it all. And so they went back in the other direction. They started deregulating things. The energy system was sold off. A lot of the state-owned enterprises were sold off, and now, actually, a lot of people don't realize that some of the Scandinavian countries are more free than the United States, economically speaking. On the Index of Economic Freedom by the Heritage Foundation, Denmark ranks way higher than the United States on economic freedom. So Denmark is not only not socialist, they're more economically free than the United States. And that's part of the reason why they still maintain the levels of prosperity that they do.
Yeah, we just had one of their candidates for parliament on the show. He was really good.
Oh, wow, nice.
None of them have any freedom of self-defense or firearms, though, right?
That's right. Yep. Scandinavian countries are very well armed. Finland is one of the most well-armed countries in the world. Finland actually has some of the lowest levels of gun control that you'll find anywhere in the world, and very, very high rates of gun ownership. Sweden also has high rates of gun ownership relative to the rest of the world, but they make it very, very difficult to get firearms. And as you mentioned, self-defense is a giant faux pas. I mean, if you shoot somebody for breaking into your house and trying to rape your daughter, you will be prosecuted.
Right. Same in England, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can hunt in Sweden if you're willing to jump through 6 months of government hoops. You can get yourself a rifle to go hunt. You have weapons to defend Sweden in case of a Russian invasion, but by and large, your average Swede, especially in the cities, is disarmed, and they overwhelmingly agree with gun control. They've been very successfully indoctrinated. Guns are either for bad guys or for government.
Yeah. What about? There's only another 3 hours to pack in the next 15 minutes, but
right.
What about the recent what we've heard about these waves of rapes of women from people coming into the country, and none of them are allowed to defend themselves at all, I guess, right?
That's true. It is very true. It's horrifying. In fact, a Swedish woman is not even allowed to carry pepper spray to defend themselves against a rapist. They would be prosecuted if they were to whip out a pepper spray and spray a rapist in the face. It's a true story.
Wow.
And it's getting really bad, and nobody wants to talk about it. But and it's not just in Sweden. You look at London. London is now ruled by a Muslim mayor. Brits are now a minority in their own capital city. Same is true in Frankfurt, right? Germans are now a minority in one of their big cities. Same is true in Malmo in Sweden. Swedes are now a minority there. Mm-hmm. And the people who are coming in are overwhelmingly from totally alien cultures, and there's a lot wrong with Swedish culture. Don't get me wrong. The libertinism, the sexual revolution really took root there, more so even than a lot of other Western countries. But to import a bunch of people from the Middle East and North Africa, it's like oil and water. And so they come. The dichotomy is incredible. They'll have these imams in the newspaper talking about, well, women are property and you should beat her if she doesn't obey you and things like this. And then on the other hand, you have a feminist government that insists on destroying men and masculinity as official policy.
Right.
What in the world is going on? Well, what they have in common is a desire to smash individual liberty, smash what remains of Western Christian style civilization. And you really are seeing the problems now with the grenade attacks, with the massive increase in crime, with the massive increase in rapes. A lot of these Muslim men come into the country and they have totally different ideas about women and how women should behave and what kind of clothes they should wear. And so some of them feel justified in raping people, and it's a big problem.
Yeah, and it's getting to where if you talk about it, you disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So
you go to jail. I mean, if you criticize the Islamism, you may end up in jail. And if you criticize the feminism, you'll find yourself at least ostracized from polite society. You'll lose your job. What are you, some kind of barbarian? You think that marriage, sex should be for marriage, and you think that marriage is between a man and a woman, and you think, if you believe those things, unless you're a Muslim, you could very quickly find yourself in trouble.
Then you're definitely a hater, and there's no such thing as illegal immigrants anymore. They're all migrants, and they have
migrants.
Undocumented. Yeah, exactly. Where do you think the campaign to show everybody that men are evil came from?
I know that's a long question. Very clearly, if you look back, what you'll find is that the Rockefellers and the Central Intelligence Agency funded and really led the women's so-called liberation movement.
Ms. Magazine, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the head of that talked in a video you can find on YouTube about how the CIA helped fund some of her efforts. And why would they want to do that? Well, if you're a totalitarian and you want to control people, if you want to run people's lives and have a totalitarian system, one of the most important things you could do is undermine the family, because strong families really have no need for big government. We can support ourselves, we take care of ourselves, and the family acts as a buffer, protecting the individual from the raw, awesome power of the state. And so if you atomize people, you get people all as individuals and the relation is directly with the state, it becomes much easier to control them. And when you don't have a family, you have more need for not just the companionship, but also the support. Well, I don't have a husband and I have this, this child I have to raise. Well, where am I going to get money from? Oh, well, here comes sugar daddy, big government to step in and help out.
Yeah, because you're created equal, so you have a right to be taken care of by the government.
Exactly right. And that's what you'll get from a government school. All right. That's exactly what they're teaching the kids.
So speaking of government schools, going quickly again, in California, since it's like the vanguard of progress into future education, what is being taught in school in California now?
Well, I actually just wrote an article about this in the New American Magazine. It appeared, I think, in the most recent issue. People can find it on the internet, too. They posted the whole thing online. But they approved this new health education framework. And it would blow people's minds, the stuff that's in there. One of the books they had recommended in there.
Health is good.
Well, yeah, how could you be against health, right? What are you, some kind of anti-health nut? But they have,
that's a healthophobic or something like
Healthophobia is a good one.
Yeah.
But so they've got a book for 5-year-olds called Who Are You? The Kid's Guide to Gender Identity, where they teach the kids that you can be any gender you want. There's infinite genders. They give them 15 different examples to choose from: agender, bigender, trigender, nu, trois, free spirit, all these different things they could be. Then they have, once you get to middle school, you start learning about polyamory, right? That old-fashioned thing about a man and a woman in a marriage. That's so outdated. Now you can have 3 men and 2 women, and that'll be a family, right? You get married that way.
And there should be possible to make a child out of all those people's DNA too, right?
Oh, that's coming too. They're working on that, trying to figure out how to splice 3-4 people's DNA together to create a Franken baby. That's all on the way. And they've got now a book recommended in this health education framework on SEX is what they call it, S.E.X, bestseller on Amazon. And they teach the stuff so horrifying you can't even talk about it, fisting and blood play, and like, what in the world? Who came up with this stuff, and who thought this was good to teach to children? Clearly, psychopaths and perverts.
Yeah, but I think those psychopaths and perverts are directed by people that are very sharply focused on what they want to get to, right?
No question about it.
What is this producing as a future society?
It's really interesting you asked that question. I actually, I was speaking in Kansas City a few weeks ago, and I met a lady who used to be a sex educator. She was one of these sex ed teachers, and she had a change of heart, and she realized, oh my goodness, I cannot in good conscience do this, so she quit her job. But she gave me a couple of books on the horrors that are produced by sex education. When you introduce little children to these concepts, they're totally foreign to them. What do 5-year-olds need to know about this stuff for? What happens is not just tremendous psychological damage. It impairs their ability to learn. It has lifelong devastating consequences. It impairs women's ability to be good mothers. It impairs women's ability to be good wives. It impairs men's ability to be good husbands. It clouds their understanding of the proper relations with the other sex.
Right.
It produces, in many cases, it can actually produce symptoms of psychopathy. If you look at so many of these serial killers, one of the things that they had in common, they engage in these perverse, sadistic sexual practices. A lot of them were first exposed to these perversions in government schools. They were being taught sex education in 4th grade, things like that. And, most people will probably come out the other end okay, but a lot of these people just snap and get very serious mental problems. Not even, don't even get me started on the venereal diseases and the destruction of families, the collapse of morality. The consequences of this are so harmful, and yet it's being pushed on kids at a younger and younger age, to the point where the UNESCO, the UN's education agency, now put out, early last year, they put out global comprehensive sexuality education standards. They want 5-year-olds to understand masturbation and sexual pleasure. They want 9-year-olds to be able to articulate why murder of unborn babies should be funded by tax money.
Why be so... God, I don't even know the right word, what kind of phobic it is, but why are you restricting murder of babies to only before birth?
Right. The governor of Virginia says, hey, we can have a discussion about it after the child is born.
New York already passed a law with no upper age limit, from what I've heard.
Yeah, you can murder that baby as he is exiting his mother.
That's later, too. If your mother's mad at you now, you have to be really careful.
Post-birth abortion, right?
Yes.
Can you imagine what a sick society we're becoming, where governors of our states are having conversations about murdering children?
And women are clapping when this stuff is announced. They're really getting damaged. But what you were saying, I wanted to comment on that, of what's wrong with all this wonderful sex education, so that kids, by the time they're 8, they're an expert in 80 different techniques they can do. I think one of the things is that the little issue that gets left out is the actual relationship between people. So they may be totally focused on, how do you get all these different kinds of high by a million different varieties in the physical sex, and there's nothing left of any relationship.
That was such a good point,
gone.
Richard. You're right. They're destroying the relationship aspect of it, undermining the spiritual component of sexual relations, and it's terribly sad. And then what you see is what we're seeing now: a massive increase in venereal disease and mental problems and abortions and unplanned pregnancy, children being raised without a father. It's just so horrifying to see this happening. It's going to lead to the collapse of our civilization. It's very strategic. They didn't just come up with this because they're obsessed with sex. This is actually an effort to undermine the family, moral values, the teaching of truth, and it's very, very dangerous. worse. It's
Yeah,
like playing with
it's
fire.
not that sex is bad. I mean, it
That's
was
right.
invented for a really good reason, and not just kids. I mean, it cements a relationship.
That's
But
right.
if the dopamine becomes the top priority, everything else is forgotten.
That's
And
exactly right.
then it's suicide.
Yep.
So, and the other element that's happening in the schools is the physical danger, not just of what's being taught, but in California, they can inject the kids with mixes of deadly chemicals and toxic metals and things without mentioning it to the parents.
Oh,
right?
yeah. They took a kid in Minnesota to go have a sex change operation. The government school did, against the wishes of the parents.
Yeah.
So now the school took a boy to go have his genitals removed. I mean, at what point do parents say, "Wait a minute, now you've crossed lines"? I mean, they're taking little girls to go have abortions, and
Right,
we think this
exactly.
is okay. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, it is, and it's really hard to fix it once it's done.
Yep.
You know, once you give the hormone blockers and stuff like that, it results in huge amounts of suicide later on. I know there's a couple of sites online that are helping people that are sorry they went through that and are trying to get somewhat back to normal again. And I know that the guy who runs one of them, it actually happened to him, and he salvaged a lot of his life and is helping other people do that. But those services are becoming illegal.
Oh yeah, California banned them. A whole bunch of states have already banned, trying to help people who are suffering from this. They want to tell pastors you're not allowed to tell people, that it's possible to leave those kinds of lifestyles and ideas. It's getting scary. It's getting really, really scary.
Yeah, and the options are narrowing because if Sweden is the future in these things, of course they would ban homeschooling because the solution would seem just keep the kid home and don't let them go where the monsters are teaching everything. But if that becomes illegal, then your options are few.
Yeah, that's exactly what they want, Richard. And I see it as kind of like the boy who pointed out that the emperor has no clothes. As soon as you have one kid who didn't get the correct brainwashing and the psychological conditioning, he says, "Wait a minute, you're naked," and suddenly everybody
endangers the whole program. Yeah,
that's right. So they need every last child. That's why the fiendish obsession with getting every last child into these programs is because if one escapes, he might wake everybody else up.
Yeah. And now these are being run by people in the government and corporate structures at the mid and somewhat lower upper levels by people who are just really well educated in the system themselves, and they're already brainwashed. But above them, the people know what they're doing, and they're doing it for, sorry if it sounds extreme, but they're, in my analysis, they're doing it for purely satanic ends, not for money or power or anything else, but it's a negative sort of spiritual, objective. And
I agree with you 100%, Richard.
It's been going on for centuries, if not thousands of years, and they think that at this point they're near the end conclusion of extermination, ceremonial sacrifice, extermination of the biosphere, because the kind of things that they're doing to damage not just humans but all life forms, they're not the revocable kind. They're not the kind that you would do if you wanted a remnant to stay and just have the whole world and enjoy it. It's not like that. I think they tell their minions that so that they'll motivate them to be okay with the 90% population reduction. But at the top, they know, and it should be obvious to anybody, they're not setting up a world for them to take over. They're setting up a world to die. And it's part of the sacrifice that they'll throw themselves on at the end so they can merge into cyberspace and be immortal. It's not going to work out that way, but they're making a big mess with that idea. So I don't think they're just going to say, "Rats, we couldn't do it. We're stopping because you guys have just one too many petitions asking us to stop,"
Yeah.
And they've got a lock on the weaponry at high levels. So it's not going to be done by violent revolution, anything good. So do you have any ideas of potential directions of solutions in our last few minutes here?
Well, I think the most important solution that anybody who's a parent or even a grandparent can implement right now is pull your children out of the system. I agree with you completely. This is a diabolical effort here. They're telling us it's diabolical. I mean, the guy who wrote the World Core Curriculum, the UN's Common Core for the Planet, he wrote in the foreword to the teacher's manual that this stuff is based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. I mean, how much more in your face can they possibly get? This is just straight evil that we're dealing with. And, don't hand your children over to evil as a good starting point. I kind of look at it like you wouldn't send your children into a burning building because you don't want, you're worried about their physical well-being. Well,
it reminds me of what Egon said in Ghostbusters, important safety tip. Don't give your kids to somebody who's going to destroy them. It's a hard concept to grasp, but you can do it. I need to
go find that quote, because that's exactly, I mean, parents, you got to get aware, you got to be involved, and protect your own children. Don't send them to the enemy to be brainwashed and destroyed, because that's what's happening. So that's the first thing I tell people. The second is, get educated yourself and educate others. And the New American is a really great resource for that. Get a subscription, and then you can hand out, once you're done reading it, give it to your neighbor, give it to your congressman, give it to whoever. A lot of the people working within the system are really just ignorant. Like you said, some of them are enticed with promises that are baloney. Some of them naively believe that, if we just create this world government, then we'll stop killing each other, no more war. A lot of them are just naive. Yeah. That's right. So we need to get people aware. And, a doctor can't fix something if they don't have an accurate diagnosis. So we need to understand what's going on before we can start dealing with it. Exactly. And part of that is, getting the rest of our fellow human beings to understand that we're facing evil.
Shaking them awake, somehow. And you're also still involved in a little bit of teaching yourself, right? In another online structure that's an approved alternative school system, at least for a little bit older kids. So how do people learn? How do people learn about that? I'm trying to finish up so you can run away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Richard. And I hate to run away. I would love to stay with you longer, but unfortunately, I've got more talks I've got to do. I got to get to Los Angeles. But the Freedom Project Academy is a great option for people who do want to pull their kids out and need a cost-effective alternative. You can find more at F as in Frank, P as in Paul, E as in Education, Freedom Project Education, FPE, USA. United States of America.org. It's an online K through 12 school, so we have kindergartners all the way through 12th graders. I teach advanced economics there, and it's a really good program for parents who want some help either with their homeschool or who want an alternative to the public school system, or maybe you can't afford one of the fancy brick and mortar private schools. Well, this is a really good alternative, and I hope people will check it out. So.
Okay, sounds good, and I hope we can do another episode shortly. But
absolutely, I would love to, Richard.
All right. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, you guys, I'm sorry that was a little bit shortened, but Alex had to run. It was amazing that we got him in the middle of his whirlwind tour anyway. And he's been an incredibly interesting guest every time he's been on. I hope he'll be back soon, because we barely scratched the surface of the subjects that we're talking about. But he left some good references, one of which was fpeusa.org. That's the school that Alex helps with and teaches at. And let's see, what else? The New American, newamerican.com, .org, I'm sorry, is another one. And you can apparently get the online version of that magazine free, including Alex's articles, and it's really good. News with Views is another one that has a lot of interesting articles on it, and it's free to have that on your come into your inbox every day. They've got new articles, and a lot of good people write for that. Anyway, I think take a further look when you have a chance at Alex's articles in the New American magazine and his work with the school where he teaches, fpeusa.org. It might be a good option for some people looking for a way to get their kids out of the public school, and if they want to do that rather than homeschooling it's a really positive option. I've heard a lot of good things about it. So anyway, that's about it for this show. I hope Alex will be back soon. And remember that we have our Saturday Lost Arts Radio live show at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 Eastern Time on Saturdays. And then the Planetary Healing Club meets half an hour after the Lost Arts Radio Live ends, and that's on a private format so that we can speak completely freely, and it's interactive. It's for anybody that really seriously has gotten some of this education and understands what's at stake in the world, and that the solutions and the countermeasures all really start from transforming yourself and your own life, and that involves some work. But it's rewarding and fun work. It's not bad. And you can learn how to get your health back, get your consciousness cleared, and start becoming who you actually always were, but shaking off this, hypnosis that we're all dealing with. And there's some practical ways to do that would probably get banned pretty quickly on public internet. So that's a private location that's a safe place to do it. And if you want to check it out, you go to planetaryhealingclub.com, and that's kind of the portal there. And if you decide you want to try it out, I'll meet you there every Saturday. In the meantime, we'll keep doing the Sunday shows like this one and putting out free videos during the week and try to provide as much good content as we can. Thanks for spending the time with us. I really appreciate it. You're really my main feeling of optimism and hope for the future. And if we can get rid of this programming that you're helpless and not too intelligent, can't do anything, this temporary little being that has to obey experts for knowing what to do in your life, it's not exactly accurate, that kind of belief. And when you find out who you actually are, it's super exciting. And even though there's some bad things happening in the world, that, this thing about threatening the extinction of all life and little stuff like that, it's not just one-sided. There are solutions that are possible, and you're actually a star player in that. So find out about it when you're ready. planetaryhealingclub.com, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.